All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our second panel in the workshop, in our day and a half workshop. I felt that this morning, I think you would all really did we tried to set the stage, and I think we did a great job of setting the stage, perhaps with more questions than answers. But nonetheless, a lot of those important questions were put out more broadly on the future of migration and analytical frameworks for migration. Next, we're going to really focus in a little bit on the future of work and how it relates to migration. So in this panel, our questions are, how do the new capacities for digital mobility shape the future of work? And what are the implications of this relationship for migration and development narrative and policy paradigm? So just like this morning's session, we're going to have two position papers. The first one is by Anna Trandifilidou, and it's entitled Migration, Advanced Digital Technologies and the Future of Work. And second is by Jaconda Herrera, and it is called Digitization, Inequalities, and the Migration and Development Agenda. We also have two esteemed discussants who will help us by starting off a little bit of the conversation before we switch to the floor and also the online environment. So we have Igor Grossman, who's a professor of psychology from the University of Waterloo, and we have Risha Shivakote, who's a researcher here a senior researcher at the CERC. So I will allow Anna to go ahead and give her presentation.
Speaking again, but as I think the fact that you'll hear me, I think 3 times in this workshop, kind of delivering a paper is part because like we have had this conversation going on for 2 years now, but partly also because someone like that was supposed to speak then couldn't come, and we had as a requirement that people would be in person, so they couldn't come. So then I picked up their place. But I think my introduction to this really follows up very well from what we started discussing in the previous panel. And it's my general reflection on advanced digital technologies and how they affect the intersection between migration and employment. And part of this reflection comes from some work that I've been doing now for nearly 3 years with a researcher. I mean, she's also a PhD student, but I would say a researcher, Laura Lamb, that has also worked with Verupa, and is not, I think, here today. And it started through an interest on digital platforms and how people engage with digital platforms. And obviously, as we started looking into who works on Uber and similar, then the pandemic happened and the whole sector really exploded, like became much bigger, and even new professional, how can I say, roles emerged from both the proliferation of people who are giving rides or bringing food, but even people who deliver services to your home, like do it yourself, cleaning, even caring. Actually, most recently with Laura Lam, we have been working on rather unusual platforms, what we call relational platforms, where you connect on a platform, but you do some work that is not a one-off, like a taxi ride or similar, but it's rather something that requires a relationship between the person who provides the service and the person who receives the service. And obviously our interest was coming from the idea that these platforms actually are often populated by migrant workers. And we were looking initially into recruitment and found that particularly in Canada, in 2 of the large cities of Canada, Vancouver and Toronto, oftentimes the people who have just arrived, regardless of status, because they could be permanent residents, but they could also be international students or temporary workers, they would start supplementing their income or having some initial income through Uber and similar. And we found that they were told that even before leaving their own country of origin, their friends, and said, first thing you do, get a driver's license, start driving so you make some money while you figure out the rest. And these were usually highly skilled people or people who were studying at university or graduate studies. And it was very interesting to actually find out that differently from what we started with, many people thought that was a convenient stepping stone. So this platform technology had a very low threshold of entry, unlike any other sector. There was hardly an interview because we were asking things like, was there an interview selection process? And they said like, no, you just put in your documents, set up the app, and you're good to go. And how this related to the nature of their work and their other, whether other employment or other activities like care for their own family or studying. And it turned out that they really liked the lack of hierarchy, low threshold, and huge flexibility. So precisely those elements that for us make platform work, from a textbook definition, platform work is very poor quality work because there's no welfare, there's no security, there's no sick pay, there is no set timetable. So you may be working very unfriendly hours when you should be with your family. There is no vacation, there is no training, there is no career prospects. But for all these reasons, somehow it was attractive to migrant workers. And of course, then the discussion is which pertains to our discussion today, I think is what kind of work do you compare with? So if I am, say, someone with a business degree that has worked for 15 years in the Philippines as a manager in a big company, and I come here and the work that is available for me on first instance is being in a shop, like at the lowest level of the retail, sales person, then and it's a very strict timetable, and maybe I have to work all weekends because that's when, in any case, the shop has most of its clients, and the most recently arrived people get the worst shifts. So then maybe I prefer Uber and similar. The other question was really what is in the platforms, and what the literature, not specifically our work, has shown is that platforms are really about the technology and about the big data. That, like, if you don't have many people working for the platform and many clients taken from the platform wouldn't exist. So there's something called a new type of hypervalue, unlike the Marxist hypervalue, that is created simply by the big data that the platform manages. So if we wanted to undermine the platform in a way, we shouldn't be using it, or we shouldn't be working on it, because if there's, I don't know, 50 and 50 drivers and 50 or 100 potential customers, Uber cannot work. But if there is 5,000 drivers and 500,000 potential customers, then the platform has this kind of new hypervalue. So that was the one question, like the people who are mobile come here to work in a kind of digital environment, which in most cases requires the physical presence, but in some few platforms doesn't require the physical presence. So presence, and this is the one reflection on where is this going? If I come, say, to Canada to build a better life, but actually then pretty much isolated, like delivering my work without getting coming to belong to any sort of community of work or getting any training or taking part into the normal workplace. And the other part that we're going to discuss also later today is what happens with digital nomads. So the people who actually also work on platforms, at least our view of the digital nomads is people who usually provide services that can be provided without the physical presence. And these people are, how can I say, voluntarily mobile in a particular way, a little bit like what is called location independent, or not traveling for work, but working while traveling. So an important feature of the digital nomad is supposed to be their choice of mobility in a way for leisure, during which they work, but being completely independent from where their work happens. So and in that case, it could be that the digital nomad is a platform worker, yet that for instance provides translation services or copy editing services or IT services, or it could be someone that has a regular employer but who allows them to work remotely and again provide some kind of services that don't require physical presence for a company that is based elsewhere. And of course, then there are many questions that arise from this, but I would like to leave that to the next panel and rather focus my intervention to this seeming contradiction in terms of technology and the future of work and mobility, where the mobile people, the migrants, engaged into digital platforms, which are kind of require a physical location that you deliver your services here, but then the workplace becomes completely digital and you have no colleagues. And on the other hand, those people who choose to travel, again, facilitated by technology, and to not have, their workplace where their usual residencies. And what does this mean for the future of work? Is this going to be a standard? Because we used to talk about atypical work, but is this going to be the new standard in the future? And I think I would leave it at that.
Okay, so I'm going to follow more or less what Anna just mentioned on how these huge differences between the impacts of digitalization on work. On the one hand, these unprotected platform workers, and the other hand, these digitally nomad workers, skilled workers. In order to articulate this with the migration and development agenda, and when I say migration and development agenda, I refer to the hegemonic state discourse on migration and development, because it's such a broad issue that I just wanted to point out that I'm thinking about this state migration and development agenda, which is something that emerged over the past 30 years and has deployed a narrative oriented to connect sending and destinations states, as well as migrant and their home communities. This is what it was about. And three issues have been discussed in this agenda. First, it started with remittances, and the idea that remittances were contributing to local development, and that migrants were very important actors in local development and in their communities, and how states should reinforce or not that kind of activity. So this was one of the first issues discussed, and there were also some reactions from migrant organizations and civil society and academics saying that this was, I mean, of course, migrants are contributing to their local community, but that should not displace the role of the state in development, that migrants were not to take the role of states, that states should be in charge of development and not migrants, no? The second issue that has been debating within this agenda is knowledge circulation, is related with skill migration, and how instead of having a brain drain, we should have brain circulation, and that would democratize the relationship, the circulation of knowledge. And the third issue, which is much more recent, has to do with what the Global Compact for Migration agreement called safe, orderly, and regular migration. Now, this the control of irregular migrant, so-called irregular migrant, and border control is now part of this hegemonic discourse on migration and development. I think these three areas, skill migration, remittances, and border control, are now very much transformed with digitalization. And this should be taken into account in this in the transformation also on the migration and development agenda. First, of course, remittances. There are many new ways and cheaper ways for migrants through digital apps to send remittances, and this is transforming the way in which many. It's getting cheaper and rapid and faster. The circulation of knowledge, of course, we just mentioned in the panel before, is completely transformed now with the digitalization, and also state control of borders, as we know, is using more and more
digital practices. So we should really get into that 3 issues are being transformed and changed in terms of the hegemonic narrative on migration and development. What I wanted to say is that we have to go beyond these 3 areas or beyond these 3 issues and look at more how issues related to labor and labor rights should enter the development and migration agenda, which is something that is not enough discussed among states, and how digitalization is really transforming labor conditions. And some literature says that there's not so much change, but historical continuity between this relationship between contingent labor and mobility labor, how always mobility labor is been part of, thank you, of contingent conditions of work. And so platform workers are really exacerbating or really showing something that has been going on historically under capitalism. And on the other hand, we know that there are many other possibilities that digitalization is bringing to work, and not only to work, but to migration in general. There are, for example, there are studies were already mentioned that show how smartphones are now part of everyday life in migrant and refugees everyday life. They help how to organize journeys. They help they are also somewhat not replacing, but at least complementing what smugglers do. So it's getting cheaper to get through clandestine journeys. It's getting safer also, because you could share information that could help to save your life if you are crossing the desert, or if you are crossing the Darien, the jungle of the Darien, and so on. Digitalization also helps migrants to get jobs, to get accommodation. It's replacing this more familiar understanding of what a network is. So it's helping what was mentioned before by Brenda. The infrastructure of migration is also, digitalization is into this infrastructure of migration very much. And you have platform workers. So it's part also of the social organization of migration in general. And platform workers, as Anna mentioned, is also seen as very easy for undocumented migrants, for example, to get into that jobs, as opposed to other kind of jobs who that need more regulation requirements and so on. So you have this other side of digitalization, very much entangled with migration everyday life. And of course, you have these transnational care family networks that are really completely different than it was 10 or 20 years ago without WhatsApp or social medias and so on. So you have also affection, care, transnational families, transnational communities. It helps transnational relationships. So basically what I look at, I want to highlight is that labor discussions should enter the development and the migration and development agenda, labor rights, labor regulations, and should enter this agenda, because this agenda has not been looking enough at labor rights. It has centered more on skilled migration, remittances, and border control. But on the other hand, that labor issues and labor regimes, when talking about migration, should be related to other regimes also, welfare regimes and immigration regimes, that we couldn't think about labor rights if we are not thinking about immigration policies. So I would stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to the two discussants. I'm not sure who would like to go first. Yeah.
I can quickly say something and then you can be more sophisticated. Something is happening. Yeah, there's a red light there.
You know what? There's a new thing here. But then is it off?
Yes, we are using that.
Yeah, we're just using this.
Not comfortable with the microphone. That's why we have the off.
I understand, it is working, but.
It's fine. I think people can hear me.
Have 5 minutes to make a statement.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Gakuma. This was very interesting. And I have just some random thoughts about both papers. I'm a psychologist, decision scientist, who dabble. Well, psychologists tend to believe that they sometimes are. Though there's a lot of research happening there. And as a psychologist, I think it's my duty to bring in the psychological perspective to migration and the question of why do people migrate and what is the role of digital mobility in all of this. We heard about two types of migrants from Anna, and this is also something that was picked up in the second presentation, namely those, for instance, who are digital nomads on the one hand, the topic we'll talk about in the next session, but also those who are migrant workers and how they use different type of digital technology in different ways. On the one hand, of course, there's a question, well, what is the experience of migration for these people? So, for instance, we heard about experience to community at home, the country that one originally comes from, and then sending money to them, supporting them. On the other hand, a big topic in cultural psychology is the question of acculturation and integration into the society, and how migrants feel comfortable or not comfortable in a new sort of chosen country that they tend to live in, either temporarily or for a longer period of time. And here I find both groups, both the migrant workers who engage with digital tech through the apps, as well as the digital nomads, not really, there's a question of whether they integrate at all. On the one hand, for instance, those who are using the apps and engage in gig economy as Uber drivers, they are on their own. They have their home community. Then they hop into the car if they are doing, let's say, Uber delivery, and they have very brief interactions with somebody. But surely they don't really have the experience that allows them to interact as much potentially with the people of the country that they come into. The type of sort of work environment is there's a lot of solitude. For digital nomads, well, they can travel around the world, and we'll talk about this next session. But often they don't mingle. They mingle, they are in their groups. The experience is such that you interact with equal-minded digital nomads, but not as much with the local culture. Some of them would like to interact with local culture, but often they do not. So that leads to the question about sort of how do these digital technologies create and potentially reinforce certain experiences of migrants. There are two other factors that are important, especially when we talk about experience, the psychological experience and psychological factors and intersection with the digital tech. Number one, digital literacy. Do they have the capacity to really engage, and do they have the knowledge how to engage with the different technological tools? Number two, and this is something that we already discussed in the prior session, digital identity. For instance, there may be intergenerative divides between the older migrants and the younger migrants. For younger migrants, the digital identity that they may be creating is the actual identity. Whereas for older migrants, that may be a bit harder unless they also find some kind of online community online, which keeps them actually connected to homes. There are also individual differences and cultural differences that may be contributing towards whether one decides, for instance, to engage with the digitally mediated gig economic platforms as a migrant. I know from my personal experiences, I moved to Germany when I was a teenager, and one of my cousin's partner, he right away wanted to get to work. Whereas we wanted to sort of invest into the future, maybe because I had to go to school. So there are different temptations. Some people have long-term orientation, others have short-term orientation. And that in turn is linked, and that's something I want to finish on, to the different types of narratives that migrants and other psychological concepts that they can bring with them, both before the migration, maybe after the migration. Some of these narratives may be culturally mediated, and they may be technologically mediated. For instance, maybe a question about whether the different platforms on which migrants communicate reinforce certain type of identities, transmit different types of narratives, because not all those narratives are initially your own. Maybe your uncle who tells you why you should be moving or should be staying. It may be somebody else from whom you heard, which is why you decide to relocate in the first place. But so far, we did not discuss these topics. And I feel like maybe we can spend also a little bit of time, not only talking about macro, I know as a political scientist, public policy, and economists, people often think about the macro factors, but also the micro factors of individuals, their stories and their motives and their struggles. Including the struggle of integrating in society, including the struggles of using the digital technologies. The last thing I just want to very quickly mention, and then I'm completely done, is that there is potentially, so far we talked about AI dangers, what will it do to us and what will it do to migrants, but there's potentially an opportunity, especially when we deal with digital technologies related to border control and figuring out how to fill out different policies. And it is very challenging for people, for instance, in India who speak a particular language that is not well represented and is not one of the standard languages, and they may be coming from a village that doesn't necessarily they don't know somebody who would be able to fill out the form for them. And I know a lot of AI companies, partially it's like, and Microsoft actually promised that at the beginning when they released the Bing AI and together with OpenAI, the ChatGPT, that potentially there is an opportunity how AI assistants can help us figure out how to navigate the digital space, even for those people who are potentially less digitally savvy and less literate. That's all I have.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Anna and Gioconda, for your presentations. So I wanted to start with Gioconda's discussions related to migration and the development agenda. And she talked about how the global discourse has evolved over time, from remittances to a focus in circulation of knowledge to migration controls and such. And I really agree with what she said on how we need to bring labor and labor rights into the discussion. It's completely missing. So my own research is related to circular contract-based temporary labor migration within Asia. And the discourse there has always been it's a win-win-win situation for the sending countries, receiving countries, and the migrants itself, right, themselves. And this positive spin really hides all the ugly realities of the precariousness and the difficult living and working conditions, among other things. So similarly, with now, what we hear so much about the use of digital technology is how it will transform everything for the better in the future of work, or all of that. But again, we need to come back to the question on who designs these technology and for whose benefit. And again, we need to bring labor and labor rights into that discussion also. So with COVID-19, and Anna wrote a little bit on this issue, I think it really gave a moment of pause for everyone. The pandemic forced us to pause and think about mobility and work and what was traditional, if it could change. So much of the work that used to be done in offices had to be done remotely, and digital technologies were used, but they were used to kind of adapt to the needs of the more privileged kind of people, to make that possible for them to work from homes, and for them to access external services like food or whatever, grocery delivery and all of that. But those on the other end had to adapt to these technologies and take more risks and be the ones to deliver food and everything else. So since the pandemic, have we been able to drastically change the way we think of the future of work? And I think it is maybe changed for the privileged, that we can still maybe, a certain sector can work from home partially, but for a lot of others, they had to go back to reality a lot quickly after the pandemic. And this kind of bifurcation is not something new at all. It has always kind of been related to your socioeconomic capital, your privilege, your skin color, the color of your passport, all of that. And we've heard discussions related to who is a migrant and who is an expat. And I think that is, coming, similar to kind of what we are talking about, platform workers and digital nomads, related to these kind of things. So while states and businesses are vying for digital nomads and the creation of these new visas, digital platform work is often for those in the margins of society. So to come to digital nomadism, it sounds exotic. You see all these, if you do a Google search, it's always someone in a laptop in a beach somewhere. But it is applicable to such a few, I think, overall number of people that, and it is based on people with certain type of passports who already have this privilege. So I liked what Audrey talked about, this ability to navigate constraints of, travel. They can do that already. So unless, we're talking about the future of mobility, unless we redesign the current passport and visa schemes, do we really need to give so much importance to this new concept? It's an elitist kind of program for maybe the more privileged, and we have other programs like that for the investors, for you can buy citizenship, all of that, right? That's there. Okay, I don't have much time, so I had other things, but I'm going to skip that. Lastly, on the topic of digital nomads, I would say that these visas are new. They started into 2020 and things like that, but people have been living this kind of lifestyle for much longer. I grew up in Thailand partially, and there you see Australians, Americans, Europeans who have done this with ease because they're able to navigate those constraints. They go in tourist visas. They, when the visa runs out, they do a visa run, they call it. So you go to another, to the border, get a new visa, come back, and it's easy. Like, I could have never done that, but for someone else, completely doable. A lot of them also have two passports. If some countries have restriction, you can have this tourist visa for 3 months, but then you have to leave for a longer time. You come back in the other passport. So things like that, it's been done for a long time. So this scheme is maybe something that has been, it's a new scheme, but people have always lived this kind of lifestyle. On the issue of digital platform work, Anna, you talked about how migrant workers are overrepresented. And I think it depends on where, right? Like in Canada and maybe Europe somewhere, but like in other places, like it's a global corporation. Uber, I saw, is in 70 countries and Uber Eats in 45 countries and all of that. So I agree with Gioconda that it is not just migrants, but people at the margins. The intersectionality of who works on this kind of work really depends. And despite the low threshold of entry, what we really can also should think about is, when they exit this, are they better off? Or are they kind of stuck in that same position for a really long time? And lastly, just to end, I think when we talk about digital platforms, it's really important to talk about regulation and how, okay, this is a global corporation, but countries and governments can take a more active role in regulating it. So some countries have started doing a little bit more. I saw that Singapore has said that they're going to strengthen safety nets for the gig workers. But I also think it's interesting that I think gig work is not open to everyone. Migrants, I don't think they can just do it. So it is citizens, and that's why they're important. That's why they're interested in having this safety net for their own citizens. So again, to tie it up with labor and labor rights is important for the migration and development agenda, but also how digital work is transforming the future of work and mobility. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really diverse discussion points, which I think is really excellent for starting this discussion. I'll follow the lead from the last session, and we'll go around the room, not classroom. I'm in teacher mode. We'll go around the room and collect questions, and then we will turn it over to my co-chair, Marcia, who will go to the virtual room and collect questions there. So who would like to begin? Oh, Dan.
I'll pass.
Oh, okay, excellent. We have Dan, Andrew Stein. Oh, Rika. Yeah.
Thanks. I'll start. Thank you very much to all the panelists and commentators. That was really interesting. On the issue about the relation between socioeconomic status or class and ability to be, is this on? I just have to have it closer. Okay, that's the problem. On the relationship between socioeconomic status and ability to perform at home, if you wish, Statistics Canada did a great summary of what happened during the pandemic. And there's one graphic that stuck in my mind. It looks at income deciles, so the 10 different cuts of the income group of Canadian workers and their ability to work at home. And it was a perfect line from almost no ability to work at home for the lowest income decile to almost 100% possibility for the highest income decile, with just almost a perfect line in between. But that's only for workers in Canada. What interests me is workers who are offshore workers. I think those are mostly in the low income kind of band, and yet they're working at a distance. And that leads me to, well, I'm talking about, for example, when I call Air Canada to get a change on my ticket, I'm talking to somebody in New Delhi. In fact, we talked about the weather last week. Compared Toronto to New Delhi, it was the same temperature, actually. No, it was 2 weeks ago now that I think about it, in the heat wave here. That ability to work at a great distance actually is true for low income workers, but they're often in another country doing that work. And that has a lot, I think, of impact in terms of immigration policy. So we're told we need, Canadian businesses need this many new workers. It's very important to know how many of those need to be physically present in Canada versus how many are going to be offshored. Like that's a pretty important policy question as to what the labor market will look like. And then my third quick point is, as I think almost all of you have raised, this has huge implications for access to social welfare, social programs, and so forth. And offshore workers, as far as I know, I could be wrong about this, but I think they have no access to pension, like Canadian pension plan or any of those kinds of normal welfare provisions that Canadians expect, even though they're working for Canadian companies. So that's kind of, yeah, okay, could be, yeah. But anyway, that's an issue. And then on the digital nomads, there's an interesting balance between digital nomads would like to go to places where they pay the lowest tax, but if they're in places where they pay the lowest tax, they're presumably going to have the lowest access to welfare benefits. Oh, I think there was someone.
Rika, yeah.
Hi. So my question really is, since we're talking about mobility and the future of work, and as Dan has mentioned, how about BPO workers? So those, business processing, so in the developed countries, so are we considering them as, part of this discussion? And the reason why is because they work for these, MNCs and, offshore companies, but at the same time, they are in a way traveling because, you travel, say, if you're Filipino in Toronto and you're just, missing home, then why call TELUS so that you can speak with a Filipino business process officer, right? So it's like, and they can like carry out conversations about cities, towns. I mean, the weather, which is amazing because then, they don't really, so they probably have, they have those, right? They have those clocks. So I'm wondering, like, is that part of our discussion? At the same time, we also have, newcomers who made use of it, and this has been mentioned, like Odesk. Odesk has been there for like the longest time, and Odesk is where you source out, before like decades ago, virtual, your VAs, virtual assistants. If you want copy editing, that's also where you source it. People come here, they can't find work, they need to take care of their children, they need that flexibility. So they work in the evening as VAs for, for Odesk, right? For a company based in the Netherlands, or like, professors who needed to do research work, right? So it is, in a way, it still is helping, right? And I wonder really, is it very much that flexibility that is helpful? And, whether, it's because it's been there for quite some time. I'm not sure now if, now we're asking for, unions or, labor standards for those sort of workers. But then again, that would be nice as well, because the thing is, they are in competition with other VAs in the developing countries who, so those who don't know what Odesk is and those types of jobs, they sort of, they bid. So meaning, whoever gets a job probably would be like bidding for like the lowest, so meaning it's a diving expedition. They'll be like, oh, I'll charge for, $4 an hour of, virtual assistant work, right? And then, so these are still competing with, people who are in the other side of the world who also have this. So meaning it's like a spoiled market, but at the same time, it's there and it's flexible, right? So, just to think about.
Hi. So I have two questions, one mainly for Anna, and I guess the other one is for Gioconda. So for Anna's, you had mentioned about workplace integration and the role of digital technology in that space, and how it might sort of break integration or break the experience of integration for many newcomers. So my question, and in my mind, when I think about, and you mentioned Uber as one of the sort of the prime examples of that, but maybe you could give me a few more examples, because one of the things that comes to mind is that migrant workers might also more likely to be working as taxi drivers. So the experience as working as taxi drivers is probably very similar to working on Uber. So that isolation might be, at least if you're talking about isolation, or not me having colleagues, or your process of integration might be very similar between being on a platform versus not being on a platform. There might be other types of platform that I'm not thinking about, but again, going back to the same thing would be, say, if you were a high wage migrant, then you're more likely to be working remotely, and maybe that the impact of digital technologies might be worse, sort of on the higher end of the wage scale rather than on the low end. So that might be a different type of issue, but yeah, it's a similar question. And then for Gioconda, you have a question. So for Gioconda, in your paper, you mentioned digitalization, and in particular, you mentioned a couple of social media platforms and how that sort of facilitates communication between migrants sending households and migrant and the household in the home country, and remittances are an extremely important part of that relationship, right? So my question is mainly along the lines of how do these platforms might serve this remittance sending relationship, right? So in most households where you have access to social media and you are connecting with your families abroad, there is this constant need to connect. So you have this ambient presence of social media always being in there in your life. So in some sense, there is constant connectivity. So there's like care work happening. There's, sharing your life, sharing images, constantly talking to your partner across the world. And then there might also be this sense where you're being monitored in a sense. So then your life outside of your home is very visible. So then your remittances might sort of reflect that. So it's just, I want to, my question is, how does those remittances connect with that digital connectivity? Right. Thanks.
Drew, if you can pass it over. And then I saw, okay, and I saw a couple of others.
So, like Igor, I'm an imperfect psychologist, and want to just make a quick statement and then a longer question that's based on some of his comments. The first is, you mentioned, I think, an important question that comes from acculturation work. Do the nomads integrate? And you could break that down. Again, what ways do they integrate? Under what conditions do they sometimes integrate? What is it like to be someone who lives in a community where suddenly there's a bunch of digital nomads who aren't really integrating, and so on? In the acculturation literature, there's actually pretty old literature going back to the 70s on a category that I think is somewhere in between Anna's category 1 and category 2, which is the sojourner literature. So these are the people who the IBM says you should go to Seoul for 3 years and help start up a factory, and then you're going to move back to New York. So it doesn't go on quite the same personal entrepreneurial scale, but there's still this idea that you might go to some place, or you might go to Japan and teach English like people used to do, and then you realize that you're not staying and you're not committing to the society, and so you make these expat communities and so on. So there may be in that older literature a source of some hypotheses or some different things that could be researched with regard to the digital nomads. My question, though, is I suppose is what do people in the panel think is the potential for meaningful collaboration between people who are more psychologists, behavioral scientists, cognitive scientists, and so on, and the sort of more traditional social sciences? The big cardinal sin of psychology, in my view, is ignoring the social world or the sociocultural world. I'm also a cultural psychologist. I was once given almost a parody answer by a psychologist about what leads people to migrate, and they said, well, there's an allele of dopamine receptor. So, and people with that allele want to migrate and people without that allele don't want to migrate. And it's like, yeah, okay, maybe. But on the other hand, you can sometimes have these I get in conversations with social scientists where the individual almost vanishes into policies and structures and historical trends and so on. So I'd be curious from Igor especially, what from as a fellow psychologist, what do you see as the real say the personality traits or the motivational characteristics that might lead even in a group of people who socially have good reason to migrate? Only some of them do, right? Why do these people do, and then these people who are under very similar social conditions stay at home? What would be some candidates for making that difference? And for the others, do you see potential in that way of seeing things, a way that doesn't ignore the real social constraints that are on the decisions we make?
Thank you. Thank you so much for really such stimulating thinking and questions. Something that I just very quickly am contemplating around is this question of integration for individuals who arrive in a country, migrants who arrive in a country and get into platform work. So take the example of Uber versus a taxi. So for me, this question is around like, how are we defining integration? Because what this has sparked, this conversation has really sparked for me is perhaps integration doesn't become a formal endeavor that, you know, in the state, in the example of Canada, for instance, the municipal, provincial, and federal governments endeavor to accomplish, but rather, Anna, to your point, you said platform work offers a lack of hierarchy, flexibility, and independence, and maybe that enables migrants who are using Uber as their way to fund their new lives to go about this journey of integration. And maybe it is that you are hopping into a car that you hailed through a digital platform, and that's the integration of the migrant who is driving that vehicle. And then that triggers more questions for me, the biggest one of which is, what does that mean for migrants who are being integrated through social interactions with people who might be in support of migration or who are anti-migration or anti-immigration? Because, and I'll leave it at this, I think that kind of question is also relevant when it comes to questions of digital nomads. Is their integration a result of or a lack of people's social interactions, and or a result of or a lack of people's social interactions who live in the places that they are digital nomads in? So lots of questions around integration. Predominantly, though, that question for me is, does integration have to be a structured, formal endeavor by the state, or is integration here being defined as our experience as an immigrant, or the experience as an immigrant as they find their place in a country? Who's next?
Thank you all for the comments and questions. I just, yeah, I'll start with what Igor said about Uber drivers and taxi drivers. That's a good question. I'm not fully sure how it works in Toronto, but I know how it works in some European cities. And as a taxi driver, you either work for yourself or you work for a small company that has some taxes. You usually belong to a union, and at least European city taxi unions are very strong, and in some cities Uber is not allowed. So that is a difference. But then the question, I think that it's a very good question you're posing, is it the nature of the work that it's an isolating work? Because still being a taxi driver, even if you belong to the union, you're pretty much alone for long hours. without a meaningful relationship with whoever is the recipient of your services. But is it the platform? And then, so that brings me to the second question is, what is the role of the platforms? And I think many of you touched upon this, and particularly Rika talking about Odesk. So in terms of and I think Richa, you also mentioned this, and I think reflecting on digital platform work, say something about how these platforms are changing the labor market, because it is a new way of organizing work where people are a very particular type of freelancer, because also freelancers existed before. And in Italy, we had this expression, partite IVA, which means VAT numbers, and it means it's the fake VAT number. So people who are actually employees, but they have a VAT number because they cannot be employed as employees. So they're employed like they provide services to one company, but they're not framed as employees. So the platforms take it to a whole new level, I think, because both there is the tyranny of the platform, the tyranny of the reviews, constant reviews. If you don't get 5 stars, you don't get many rides or many requests for services. In several platforms, particularly, for instance, TaskRabbit, but also several of the care providing platforms like CareCom and similar, you have to market yourself. So if you are in a platform where you want to be hired as a babysitter, you have to say how you love classical music and how you are a very outdoors person and get kids to the playground. And possibly you put things about your hobby and you put your picture. And that happened also before. I think 10 years ago, you would go on an internet site called Babysitter.com or something like this, and you'd see that. But this, again, I think the technology gives it a whole new dynamism, and it reflects on what I said in the previous panel about the platform being possible because there's so many of us engaging with it as workers and as users. And this creates this actually percentage, this hyper value of the platform. And it seems to me like I'm like, you take a Uber to the airport here and it's about, I don't know, $45, $50, and a taxi would be $70. But apparently what the worker gets is $25. Now, a ride from my place to the airport is 40 minutes in a good day. So $25, and you pay for your gas, you pay for your car. There's no I mean, now Uber has improved a bit. There is some insurance against accidents, etc. But there's nothing else. So it's pretty low. Which brings me then to the regulation, because I think Richa raised that. And for instance, in Ontario, there's been a whole lot of negotiation. And I think there is something about the fact that many of the workers are migrant workers, because to the best of our knowledge from our research, those who mobilized were Canadian born or citizens at least, because they relatively recently arrived, they wouldn't dream of mobilizing. And what Uber said is, I'm going to contribute to a fund that the Ontario government will create, and that will pay for the welfare of the drivers. But that would take away the possibility of recognizing the drivers as workers. And we know in different countries around the world, in South Africa and the UK, I believe also in Brazil, drivers have been, courts have been recognizing the platform workers as workers. So that is where the technology actually is eluding the law. And I guess the lawyers tell us more about it. Like, how can we pin down what is the platform? It's not an employer. It's not an intermediary. There's no person behind it. And I don't even know, because Ibrahim earlier was talking about the economic interest behind technology. I don't know what are the then I started thinking, like, who created Uber in the first place? If we don't know who created ChatGPT, I never asked myself who created Uber and Foodora and the similar. And just to get to my last point, I think someone was, I'm not sure who was pointing to that, the relationship between technology and migration or income status could be a U. I think, Stein, you said that, like it could be in a U form, because Daniel said earlier, it's probably a line like low income, no remote work, high income, remote work. But I wonder whether it is more like a U in a U form. And I think, the question that you posed, Lucia, remains open. So are these people, are the platforms exercising their agency and resilience? But then to our psychologist, that was this person more resilient in the first place? And would they be resilient anyhow? Anyhow, I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you for all these comments and reactions. First thing, I think it's important not just to look at the contrast between digital nomads and platform workers, but also it's with the Uber example, comes to my mind that it's also important to look at heterogeneity within platform workers, because one thing, and I think you mentioned in your paper, and I also have another example, one thing is to look to work for Uber, and another thing is a cleaning platform for women, and my you know, what there are platform jobs more oriented to migrants, and others that have requirements to have documents and a legal status, so that they are more oriented to people resident in the country. So you have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of type of work, if you have legal status or you don't have legal status, and in terms of flexibility also. Because I think that there are many changes, changes in the world of work should be intertwined with changes in everyday life also. I was thinking in another example on how a migrant woman could work for some hours in a cleaning platform and then go to a care platform, take care of things, and then she could sublet her apartment in order to get incomes through another platform. So you have, like, it's also a flexibility of what of how to get your income. So it also poses some questions on what the place of work, of a traditional understanding of work means, as opposed to multi-activity or several forms of getting income that are also more available through platforms and digitalization. So just to insist on how, if we think about work, but in this digital world, it's very much, the division that we usually have in mind of private, public, work, leisure work, or care or work, and reproductive issues is really very different in digital terms. And I think we should think more about this. Yes, I well have many other the remittances and digital connection, and it has to do with this also. I really think there is a very important digital transformation for care, affection, communication, information, which is really important. But also control. As you know, all these issues about communication, it's about affection and control at the same time, always, no? So even in social media, if you communicate with your communities or families in descending countries, you always play with how you want to appear, how you want people to, what do you want people to think about yourself, what kind of identity you want to communicate. And so now we know always that this is something there's a lot of agency. So in that, so yes, I think it's important to think about control and communication at the same times, always. What could be the relationship with remittances? Maybe because of control. Migrants are always complaining about how, they want to have control of what's going on with their remittances. They are not being invested in what they want to or supposed to. There's a control. Men control women and how they have to spend the money and so on. And the opposite is also true. So yeah, it could be more control actually, yes, in that sense.
I know there were a few other questions. In fact, from the discussants, if there's anything you all wanted to
But
add.
there are so many. I thought it was very interesting, this comparison with offshore workers and digital workers. But I think Anna also mentioned that there are very specific issues at stake when talking about digital workers. I don't know what else.
Maybe I can ask the discussants if they had anything.
I think if you look, Andrew, you had a question to me, and I think the Uber question was also kind of to Anna and myself. So quick about the Uber and taxi drivers. I didn't just mean Uber. I also meant other type of gig economy jobs, including food delivery, most of which I think, well, not all of them, but a lot of them are probably also done by migrant workers. But more specifically to you, so you had a question about what are the psychological characteristics of a person who is probably, or the family that is more likely to move versus stay. I mean, you probably know this better than I do. So you're quizzing me. I can anecdotally talk from my personal experience and just some general theories. I think, as usual, it's complicated and there are multiple levels to it. Number one, if you have social capital in the form of a connection, maybe somebody already moved, maybe you know somebody in the country, you have a vision, you have a narrative, and that you can envision being in this other place. I think that's definitely a powerful tool. On the individual level, if the family is a little bit more risk-taking, on a socioeconomic level, if the family has necessary resources to move in the first place, because you need to have at least some resources, at least some savings, because otherwise how can you bribe somebody, or how can you sort of like buy the ticket to get to the new country? How can you start a new living? And yeah, I think those are the main ones that I can think of. I think at the end, there's another one, and that is, if you're in an absolutely hopeless situation and you have nothing else to lose, and there's nothing else that connects you after some atrocity that may have happened in your home country, then it's probably much easier to move if you have ties. So like the presence of social ties in your home country, if you don't have that many, that obviously plays a huge role. So those are, but this is just me rambling based on my experiences and some general literature.
There are a lot of things, but yeah, I just wanted to talk about regulation. And, you know, I said it's important and all of that, but then the first thing that happened after Singapore announced this changed, that it requires safety nets for gig workers, was the company said, yeah, you know, it's a good idea, all of that, but that will mean it's going to be more expensive. And at the end, who's going to, you know, pay for it? It's most likely going to be customers, right? So as customers, for all of us who use Uber and whatever platforms, what Anna just said about using Uber and taxi and the price difference, $45 to $70. I mean, we are using Uber instead of a taxi because it's so much cheaper, and all of us are benefiting from this precarity, gig work, and all of that too. So just wanted to raise that issue.
I wanted to turn it over once to the digital audience, just because I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to get their comments in. So maybe Marsha, I'll turn it over to you.
So we have two comments from our wonderful online audience, and both comments are from Naomi Albuim. Her first comment is about integration. What does it mean? How we kind of define and frame, both theoretically and analytically, about integration. So I'm going to read the comment because it's really very informative and interesting comment. So she wrote, I'm struck by the notion that digital workers or digital nomads do not integrate because of the lack of personal contact with colleagues and the workplace. This is exactly the argument made by many employers who are requiring their employees to return to the workplace post-COVID, even though their work can be done effectively virtually, both individually and in virtual teams. This raises the issue in both cases that it is not just about work, but the more intangibles like culture, social connections, loyalty, etc. So how do we basically define integration? Is it necessary for workers to be in workplace to be integrated? Whether being at workplace mean that they're actually socially integrated? We can think about different low-wage, low-skilled workers who are working maybe in the service sector. Are they socially integrated in terms of our ideal definition or our general definition of integration? So I'm just adding some of my comments as well. So her second comment is about having equal opportunities on the digital platform. So she wrote, just like any new entrants to the workforce, for example, young people, graduating students, women re-entering the labor market, migrants are probably disadvantaged in terms of workplace orientation, finding mentors, understanding workplace culture, growth opportunities if their work is completely digital. So in the complete digital format, the social inequalities that exist also kind of reproduced in the digital platform. So I would like to know about your comments and thoughts on these two comments from Naomi. And we don't have any other comment or question as of yet from
great.
our online audience.
Who would like to tackle that? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we can collect one more.
And then Chris. This one here.
Thank you. It's been just a fascinating discussion, and I'll speak to some of the comments that were made from, I live in Seattle, Washington, where we're seeing market share being lost by Uber and Lyft because their prices are so much higher than taxis. And, like $40 higher for certain taxi rides are higher for Uber and Lyft. And Uber and Lyft is also looking at how many migrants they're using, because there's been increasing problems being reported to both Uber and Lyft because social and cultural aspects are coming into how the drivers are handling passengers, which are inconsistent with how the Seattleites view themselves and what they prioritize. And so the companies are looking at how they're going to manage this going forward. And that's just a microcosm. So it is very complicated. And this is not just a one-way direction. It's going to be a two-way direction. We've also seen call centers moved from outside the US to the US, and is being used as an advertising campaign of when you call our call centers, you're only talking to people within the US. So both ways.
Yeah, sure. But you cannot find out what's. I think I'm good with one. I was gonna say, but you cannot find out what the weather is in Delhi if you speak to someone who is also in Seattle, as I was saying earlier. So I have a couple of comments going to this idea of this is about the future of migration and labor. Number one, I think there's a big distinction in terms of a digital nomad who brings their work to a beautiful sunset and a nice place, but they have work already. They don't go to the country to find work, right? And the idea of a migrant who's moving maybe for several reasons, but in the end, they have to find a job. And as Anna said, these sort of jobs might be low-cost entry, working for all these platforms. I think there's also a big differentiation in terms of working digitally in the ways that us academics might have worked during the pandemic, and using a platform as your way to get your clients, right? I think there's a big distinction there. There is interaction. I mean, at least in New York City, where I live, there is interaction with the drivers in the sense that, part of the work is to get someone in the back seat, and some people might talk, some might not talk, but still there is some sort of interaction there. But I think there's two big aspects that the papers bring out, right? One, I think, has to do with the future of globalization. So a lot of economists say that we are not globalized, actually, because capital is free to move. goods are free to move, but labor is not necessarily free to move, right? And there's a lot of them who actually say this is the development strategy. This is how we're going to develop, by letting people moving freely and allocating labor more efficiently, right? But there's also a big question about cities. And usually when you have big shocks like COVID, you have everyone who says, that's it, it's the end of cities. Like living in New York, I heard it several times, 200,000 people left. I don't know what the city's going to do. And the idea that the environment where migrants operate and digital nomads operate, or the work environment, is completely distinct from the social, from what is happening there, which is not the case, because a lot of people are living in cities and pay like extremely high rent, right, to be in New York City, not only because they need to physically be at work, but because of everything that happens surrounding their work. Again, economists speak a lot about agglomeration economies, right? And the idea that by concentrating in specific areas, there's a lot of gains that are not only happening during the office hours necessarily, right? So I want to hear your comments about these sort of distinctions and what you think this means for kind of the future of cities, because a lot of migration is happening towards urban areas.
Yeah, and Alka, and then.
Yeah, thanks for great presentations. Richa, you mentioned a couple of times, you talked about the whole idea of win-win for all parties. And of course, that is what is the ugly face of precarity. And just to kind of talk a little bit more about that, absolutely, I totally agree. And it's, and on the one hand, like, it's really important for people like researchers and others who advocate for what needs to really happen. But the point is, since Uber workers and other people who have flexibility and they like to do this work because they can be at school and they can be working another job, and you can do it in your own time. There's no real pressure and all of that. So somewhere, I think the issue of choice is so important. Even when people come new to the country, there are a lot of people who come, they're coming because they want to make money. They want to have a better quality of life. So as researchers, we may talk about underemployment and de-skilling and all of those big issues. But if we're looking at it from a perspective of individual choice, then I think there should be no problem with those who want to do this. And of course, those who don't, that's the structural systemic issues that need to be really addressed. So, and again, I used to always think about, this whole child labor thing in India. One doesn't want to condone it, but then if they didn't work in that little kiosk somewhere, they wouldn't even get food, So somewhere we have to see what is the context, that kind of thing. And then I think integration was a really important thing. Lucia, you started that conversation. So the integration is at so many levels, as Naomi said as well. It need not be just with the workplace, and with COVID and virtual, we know that we didn't have community, but there are so many other ways of finding and creating your own community. So again, as a process, all the different pieces that we need to put into what does integration even mean? For each person, it's different. For an introvert, it means something different. For, what are the things that we do to make that happen for us? Thank you.
Yes, so I wanted to come back to the discussion about the labor rights. And so the response that Anna made about the fact that some courts have forced the platforms to recognize the workers for the platforms as workers. And so I think that what this reflects is the fact that local regulators, so either national or also cities can also sometimes play a big role in that, have a role to play in shaping the way platforms affect the lives of the one working for these platforms. And that we often think of these platforms as something exogenous, as something designed by engineers, but actually we should consider them as co-produced with also the local political actors, and that these local actors have also a responsibility and should also be held accountable for the situations that they are in. And I think it also relates to one aspect which is important, is the question of algorithm. And so sometimes people speak about algorithmic management. So it was what you were referring to, for example, with the ratings and things like this. And so I think one of the problems with this is that often these algorithms are not transparent because they are considered to be intellectual property. And so the question is, how do we deal with this? And shouldn't there be a transparency over these algorithms so that we can determine like the effects that they have and whether they're legitimate or not. So yeah, I think this is just a general question about this.
Are there any others? I don't know if we want to address a few of them, and then we'll go to some more after.
Yeah, it's a very very interesting, a very lively and critical conversation. Yeah, I wanted to reflect a little bit also on what Rika said earlier about the bidding, which is I did not know about that, but also in relation to call centers and how they relate to migration. So, for instance, again, where in the country where I lived for long before Italy, there's the call center, like you would call the call center of Vodafone, and it would say the person may be responding from outside Italy. If you don't want that, press 1, and then you would be taken from the call center. The people who were responding were mostly based in Albania, and actually usually they had been former migrants to Italy, so their Italian was impeccable. I mean, there might be a very light inflection, and I'm also non-mother tongue, properly speaking. So it's like, so I think that says something about the interaction between this migration and the the digital mobility, and the offshoring and reshoring of jobs. And also in that sense, maybe what I was thinking, I think Gioconda mentioned that like ethnicized labor markets, or what is called here racialized labor markets, remain ethnicized or segmented on and off the platform. So taxi drivers also used to be migrants and refugees, and now the Uber drivers are migrants and refugees. So I think that brings us also to what Jeremy you just said. And actually, I wanted to say for those who are not familiar, because you're only users of these platforms, yes, the biggest threat of a platform to a platform worker is disactivation. And it's not transparent why you were disactivated. The platform doesn't tell you. And you could be disactivated because you got a low rating, because a customer complained, or for any other reasons. So some of the platforms are making it even more sophisticated. So if you're not taking high tips, that reflects also as if it were like, so if I give 5 stars but don't give a high tip, that may reflect negatively, which is horrible. It's just plain horrible, which says also something that this platform is not just a platform. This in a way, someone, I don't know, Big Brother behind it. And I think the bidding, for instance, wouldn't work if it wasn't for a platform. Because yes, we had this offshoring before. Maybe you could I don't know, for instance, you could have a translation service. You go to this company based in Milan, but the company is hiring people offshore. But when you have a platform, you can do the bidding. So I think that's where technology enters the labor market and the workplace big time. So I think that's something, and how this, of course, relates to being a migrant or the job migrating, or actually, as I was saying, getting a migrated job as you were formerly a migrant, and actually how even we had done some work with returnee migrants from Italy and Greece to Albania, where particularly those who had returned from Italy, that was a capital that they were using in their reintegration in the job market in Albania, both in terms of social networks, but also in terms of desirability. Someone who speaks Italian, has lived in Italy, knows things over there. And just the final thing, I think, Naomi, your comment about migrants being disenfranchised in terms of integration, that's very, I think a very interesting comment, because as I think Lucia was also saying, we define integration very sophisticated ways, but we don't ask what And I always say, yeah, being integrated. Am I integrated? Like it's a process you're always in the process of becoming. Are you integrated here? This is a good question, but like the role of agency and how I may feel in control of my integration, but someone else much less so. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think this debate on integration reminds me a lot of what was the debate 20 years ago on transnationalism and this idea that people doing having transnational connections and looking always to their sending communities were less able to integrate because they were not thinking about their in situ communities, but they were just very nostalgic and sending remittance and just only thinking about their own country. And there was a lot of debate on how this was not actually what was going on, that the more integrated in terms of socioeconomic integration, the more transnational they could be. So I think that with the digital issue, that might be something similar. It's not because you are more digital that you are less integrate, because maybe the opposite is what is going on. If you are very digitally integrate because you are part of a lot of opportunities and capacities in situ. And I think it has to do also with what do you mean by are we talking about socioeconomic integration, so having a good job, decent conditions and so on, or what is it, or are we talking more about cultural integration, which is more problematic because maybe I just don't want to integrate with the cultural society I'm it's so plural. So it's I think it has many different dimensions. Another issue we haven't talked about, and I think it's kind of basic when we talk about digitalization in general, is connectivity. I mean, not everybody has the same connectivity, and this is a huge issue for. It reminds me how, for example, in refugee camps now, one of the basic needs is connectivity. It's like food, or even more like food. It's information. So I think this is also very important, and this is something, I mean, we haven't discussed yet, and I think it's sometimes it's really part of all this. It's becoming a need and a basic need. I think another interesting discussion is, again, if our lives are defined through work as they were before, as much as they were before. And now I think that work is part of life, but there are many other issues at stake. Even if you have, I mean, even for low income people, even, and it brings me to the city and urban setting kind of issue. And maybe that if we really need to think about work as related with social reproduction and with leisure at the same time, and how you reproduce yourself, your identity, your community, your family, is not only about work. And I think we really need to think about this, that in migrants' lives, so what do we need as a city? It's not just to become a place to work, because you could do it digitally, but it's really, you need other kind of issues, and social reproduction should be taken into account more and more, I think, to talk about integration, for example, and to talk about cities and cities transformation and the economics also. It's, yeah, I would think. And labor, and same thing for labor rights. I mean, if you you can't talk about labor rights if you are not talking about immigration policies when you are discussing all these issues. I don't want to get into this algorithmic issue. It scares me because of the control issue. So just let it like that.
Thank you so much. I know there's a couple of other questions in the room, but I wanted to ask Marcia if there were any other questions online. No. Okay, so we have Brenda and I saw your hand earlier. So we have a few. I'll just pass around the mic. Thank
Hello, hi. I just want to first address this visibility that you mentioned. When people are on platforms, they're visible. And I just want to ask, because I don't know how they pay taxes. You said that the woman can go to be a babysitter, then she can sublet her apartment or whatever. She has to pay taxes for all of that if somebody can easily find her. Whereas in the black market, where some immigrants actually supplement their income, they just go by the word of mouth. I'm going to be a babysitter for you and you're going to pay me cash, and nobody sees that. I'm on platform, they're going to find, like on Facebook. Okay, you were in Spain where you were saying you were working. So they're going to find you easily. Here's your picture. So somebody can trace you more easily. Whereas I'm just asking for these gig workers, whether they pay taxes and how do they do that? I don't know that's why I'm asking. But I do know people who work as cleaners or babysitters and are not on platform. They're so-called black market. That was my.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for your presentations and all the comments and questions. I had 2 points to make. One on the legal aspect. So the legal qualification of gig economy workers into workers and not into just self-employed. To the best of my knowledge, that there is not much of a change in that. It's just what changed is the way in which work is done. But the case law, the jurisprudence, it's still the same. It's a question of subordination. Is there subordination in the way that someone is working? Then you're a worker, employed by someone. If there is no subordination, then you're not going to be qualified as a worker in this sense. And so far as I know, the case law is quite clear in that. UK Supreme Court case law, CJ Court of Justice of the European Union case law, it's quite regular on that. So what changes is the way in which we're now working and having these platforms, which brings me to a second point, which is we talk a lot about the negative aspects, but I wanted to think a little bit about the positive aspects. So for example, and linking that to questions of immobility in migration. So for example, we would have now these platforms that would not just thinking about Uber, but thinking about, so anecdotally, I was organizing a move between Geneva in Switzerland to Exeter in the UK, and using a platform to find a moving company that would be 10 times cheaper than anyone that you would get locally in Geneva, Switzerland. And the driver was a guy from Romania, super nice, that drove my boxes all the way to the UK, and was telling us that otherwise he would have wanted to migrate to the UK, but because he can have this type of job, and that I wouldn't have found him because he's in Romania. And so you need this intermediary. So then that creates an opportunity for him to continue living in Romania and not have to move and leave his family and so on. And the same with other types of workers. For example, in the creative industry, there are lots of web designers and so on that live in developing countries. So to give you another anecdote, those living in Brazil, where I know a bunch of people like that would do work for companies based in the US or in Canada and so on. And so that would maintain them in their country of origin and would not make them move. So that's this relation with immobility that also links with this question of remittances. So would that be the new type of remittances in parentheses? Like, before we were thinking about remittances as a way of maintaining people in their country, but that would need to have someone that moved before and was sending the money back. But now perhaps it's just the person stays because the money comes directly from the companies whom they work. And so that creates this security domestically, but obviously not applicable to any type of workers and so on. So there's just something that came to mind. Thank you all.
Thanks. This is a question for Gioconda, although I'm grateful to everybody for a wonderful panel. Can you say more about the responses of organized labor in the face of these challenges? I know you've talked about labor rights and labor labor regulation. I'm just curious if I'd just like to hear more about how they are conceptualizing their role, in the face of the deterritorial, all of these phenomena that you're talking about, and whether as a kind of social movement, the labor movement has been thinking about this, and if so, how they have gotten creative or not in response to these sorts of challenges.
Hi, I think my questions are actually quite similar to Anna's. The first one is just out of, because I don't know very much. So these platforms mediate between the worker that's offering a service and the client. So how do you define the employment relationship? So, I mean, is the platform the employer or so I guess I just needed that clarified. A second question is, these platforms serve to mediate, and in relation to migration studies, I mean, what about like throwing to the fray digital brokerage? I mean, this whole field that's emerging that is not so much replacing the broker, the human figure, the broker, but supplementing the work of migration brokers. These are recruitment and placement agencies. And particularly during COVID, I mean, there was a big move of these kinds of brokers into the digital space. And you see that in education, migration brokerage as well. I heard a paper recently on this space being now taken over by influencers. Influencers, is that how you pronounce? Yeah, so performing this kind of brokerage intermediary work. So I guess maybe straying beyond the migration and work kind of stuff, but in migration studies, I mean, I think thinking about digital labor, maybe there's room to consider digital brokerage.
Okay, so we have two more questions from our online audience. First question is from Fabiola. She's asking, what are your thoughts about the silent quit and its relation to the increasing relevance of digital work mobilities? Do you think that the trend is there to stay and could be an indicator of a more durable revolution in the future of work? A lot of people are quitting their job, especially after the pandemic. Yeah, quit. Oh, so sorry. She wrote silent quit, so that's why it's okay. All right. So so this is the first question, and then the second question is from Roshwi. So the question is, coming back from the question on taxes, it got me thinking if platform work can help in formalizing the economy as opposed to informal economy. This could be connected to social safety net mentioned earlier and access to social protection. Or given its current state of unregulation, it is perpetuating, or is it perpetuating the informal economy? So is it basically another version of informal economy? That's the question. Okay, that's all from the online audience.
There's a leave to Igor. Yeah, thank you all for very interesting questions. So reflecting to the question about taxes and visibility. So yeah, work on platforms is visible, but the taxes are not withdrawn by the platform. So at the end of the year, you think that's where also the question of like, we pay $50 to go to the airport and it's better than $70, but the worker actually puts in their pocket even less than 25, because at the end of the year, there comes the tax slip because you haven't prepaid any taxes. So actually those, and the fact of the matter is that many people who are engaged in platforms, they may work for a relatively short period. Some people are there for 2 or 3 years, but some people may be there for 6 or 9 months. So, and then at the end of the fiscal year, you get this big tax, return that you have to pay. What is very interesting in what you asked is in the work that we're doing between the relational and non-relational platforms, and we call non-relational those like providing like ride hailing or food delivery, versus relational being those who provide whatever kind of services that are repeated. It could be cleaning that can be repeated, or caring, or any other small job. And yes, we find that people then take it off the platform. So you have that clear that comes once or twice, and then you say, how about you come every so-and-so and I pay you that, and we take it off the platform. And what we have found in the research with Laura Lam is, particularly care workers would like that, because actually the pay is much better. And then it's also because even, basic care work to someone who is very ill or very old, or babysitting is rewarding and has a relationship, and then you kind of find the the matching, and the pay is better. Few times, and we found this mostly with cleaning, the person didn't like disappeared and didn't pay. And while when you are in the platform, but I don't know what capacity has the platform to oblige. If I deactivate my account as a customer and disappear, what will happen? I'm not sure. It's probably that you prepay on the platform. And I want to say also that many people have multiple accounts on multiple platforms to fight disactivation, so because they're afraid. And also we know that as far as I know, like I've only read research about this in the UK, that people like migrants who are not, who don't have status, sub-rent accounts from others who can be migrants or locals. So the same account can be used throughout the 24 hours by 2 different Uber drivers, none of whom has documents. The money apparently is relatively small, like how much you earn is sub-renting your account, but still is something. And also in terms of the relationship with migration, actually, again, researchers who work particularly in Germany say in Germany, Uber would not be possible, or Uber Eats, if it wasn't for migrant workers. It just wouldn't be possible. Now, I'm not sure that would be a good question also for quantitative sociologists to try and find out, because our work is mostly based on online surveys and qualitative interviews. So we find the mechanism. I don't know. Again, for instance, in Toronto, Vancouver, what is the percentage of the migrant workers? I have to say we try to recruit non-migrants defined as Canadian born, and we try to recruit also for the relational platforms, and it's much more difficult than recruiting someone who works in Uber and skip the dishes. And so I want and on this I wanted to say also that we had connected with something called the Fair Work Platform, which is an initiative starting from the UK and includes some countries, including South Africa, Brazil, and a few others. And the platform rates the platform. So this this website rates the digital platforms per country in terms of the different legislation or provisions in terms of their fair work, and they have very clear criteria. And actually we were trying to raise some funding to bring this to Canada. We haven't succeeded so far. The question of course is then, and I think we would need to be more effective, to find the funding is who is consulting, like, because your power with this website is, are there thousands of users consulting this or thousands of workers? So they choose to work, say, for, I don't know, Foodora or Skip the Dishes rather than Uber Eats, or will it just remain as one tool that is that is not used? But I think, yeah, the whole question of the digital brokerage is also very, very important.
Well, with regards to organized labor, I mean, there are this movement of platform workers, at least in what I know in Latin America, are getting, quite strong. The issue here is what are the place of migrant workers within these organized movements, because this is also a difference between, I think, the global South, or at least what happened in some countries in South America, from what is going on in New York, Toronto, or London, is that in the North, my impression is that really migrant labor is into platform work, whereas in countries like Ecuador or Peru or Colombia, platform workers is shared between migrants and other workers, and even the other workers, native workers, are more and more than migrant workers in the share of. So it makes it very different in terms of organized labor. So I think the question is if migrant workers are into these organizations also, if there are differences, if they are struggling together or not. And it's very different whether the market is shared between migrants and non-migrant workers, or whether you have migrant workers in this labor force. So this is what I can say about that. But yes, and the other discussion I read is that it's not just about being recognized as workers and not just self-employed, because this is the issue. And yeah, I understand this idea of who is the employer. That's precisely the problem with platforms, that there is no employer. You don't have, if you want to put a claim, they don't really know sometimes to whom they have to complain, to whom they have to ask for, protection, or even if they are not getting paid and so on. That's the whole issue, that the employer is not so visible. The idea is that you are self-employed. You have your own business because it's your own platform. So that's why I don't see, I mean, there are big differences, but of course these employment agency which were before in situ are now digital. I mean, there isn't much difference. It's this, the whole issue is very similar, and problems are similar in that sense. Whether platforms are making more, are giving more possibilities to for formal work, or are they perpetuating informal economy? I don't know. Both, I would say. Depends, because this is also something we have to think about, that they are very different. Some are more regulated, others are very unregulated. So in some platforms you do pay taxes, but in others you could avoid that. So it's very plural, very heterogeneous. So I think that some are really perpetuating informal relationships between workers and employers, because they are exacerbating, and they have this idea that you are self-employed and not that you are visible. Right, yes. Right, they control you. So yes. So I think both, that, yeah, I'm saying. I mean, maybe you could use platforms in order to make more visible and control nasty employers and so on. I don't know.
I don't know how long you're in Toronto, but in the time when Uber drivers were introduced, taxi drivers protested and they went to drug Tory.
Yeah.
In order to say we don't want Uber, that will jeopardize our well-being. So huge protest for the city hall. Taxi drivers protested against Uber. And John Tory was a champion of Uber. He was like all over. He wanted Uber. And he supported them. He supported that plan.
Yeah.
I don't know whether
Yeah.
you know about it, but that was all over the world, media. Right?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, they have. I just want to add something on the employment relation. And I'm not a lawyer, but I think there's something new there because the platforms say, yeah, we're only doing data sharing, information sharing. We're not part of the employment relationship. But yeah, courts have found that they are part of the employment relationship. Now, since the digital platforms will continue to exist, they're not going to cease to exist. The question is, so then courts have legislated in favor of the workers. In a famous case here in Canada, Foodora left Canada simply when the court found that Foodora was the employer. Now, I'm not sure what has happened in the UK or Brazil where such cases were won. But I do think that there is, and there has been this also what you raised, Anna. Yes, it does give opportunity for income, and then again it relates to migration. But still, I wonder whether we need some other form of both welfare concept and maybe concept of work that would cater, because the platforms will continue to exist in multiple forms.
Okay, so what was the question about silent quitting? Marsha, do you want to repeat it quick? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The remote work.
Yeah. 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 All right. Yeah. Okay. I have no idea. I mean, I'm a psychologist. There's not really a psychological question. So quiet or silent quitting is about, people disengaging and doing just the bare minimum. So for those of you who don't know, and this can have multiple causes that I can speculate about. One of them is the cultural change in societies and great appreciation of, lifestyle balance, and not being the office man who's just or the company man, as they call them in Japan, right? That who just lives for the company and never shows up at home. It can be partly. Yeah, it could be partly the burnout. It could be the realization during the pandemic that you could do things differently, and unwillingness to return to basically committing yourself entirely to the company. So, I mean, part of it is due to that. Part of it is due to lack of compensation. Now, whether this has implications and connection, it's an interesting empirical question. I don't even know how to test it. If maybe somebody has some good data for that. I would not think so. But I just speculate. I mean, what would be the process through which this form of cultural change and basically protests of mostly white collar workers of just doing the bare minimum, not participating in any further way, would lead to greater engagement on digital platforms? So that's, I think, that the translation, right? I don't see the connection there. So I don't think it would be, but I mean, it's just my opinion.
I just wanted to actually just add a little. It's not really quite quitting, but after the pandemic, I think there's a like burnout of nurses, that they were not being paid enough for, you know, all that work kind of thing. So there's been an increase in travel nursing right now. So it's using an agency or an app to find, so you quit your regular job with its benefit, but then this travel nursing, Alberta needs a nurse in ICU for 3 weeks or 3 months or whatever, but they pay you like double or triple. So you go there if you're like at a certain age or, you know, life course, all of that matters. Then you go there for 3 months and then you go somewhere else so then you travel plus work and then you save and there's flexibility. So especially in nursing, that's something that nurses are talking about, like, you know, like, and really like from the regular mundane kind of job moving up. I know Rupa wanted to say.
I just wanted to mention one kind of answer. I think maybe it was mentioned, but I think, Brenda, you asked, what is the employment relationship? In general, in most places, they're considered self-employed. That's how it's classified if you are an Uber or a platform worker. In a few places, you're classified as a dependent contractor, but in most cases, you are what we call an independent contractor or self-employed. We are actually out of time. We're actually over time for the session. So I'm going to end it here. Thank you to every single one of you for engaging so much in this conversation. As you can see, there's just so many angles and lenses and layers to look at. Thank you to both of the speakers. Thank you to both of the discussants, and thank you to everybody both in the room and online for engaging in this conversation.